Sometimes, in fact, often, there is just so much in the readings that I wish I could just sit down with all of you for a couple of hours and discuss it and get feedback and tease these things out. But as it stands, we've got about 10 minutes. So let's see what we can do in that. Normally, I would kind of concentrate on one point. This time, though, I just want to throw three things out there about this reading that you might want to mull over and think about a bit. One long one and two very short ones. The long one is what this reading tells us about these things that we call the Gospels. Now, at the moment, some of you would know that my husband, Mike, is busy writing a history of this diocese. And he's reached a time where he's writing about people that are still alive can remember quite clearly. And that is a lot like what Mark and Matthew and Luke were doing in their own time. Now, John's a bit different. John, you get the impression he's looking back at the end of a long life and reminiscing over this formative part of his life. But the other three were gathering stories from people, harvesting memories, and then sorting out how best to put it together in the most helpful way for their communities. Now, in today, up until now, the story that Mike has been writing about the diocese has been based mostly on material that other people have already written, or speeches or whatever it might be, synod talks. And that's kind of what the Old Testament was for the people in Jesus's time. But now Mike is interviewing people, he's hearing stories, he's realizing how many angles there are on one character, depending who it is that you're talking to. And quite often, people will say to him things like, I can't remember exactly who it was, but someone said so-and-so. And we get a lot of those sorts of stories in the Gospels, stories where you can imagine someone coming up to Mark and saying, I can't remember the name of that leper, but I've never forgotten what Jesus did. You know, situations where all the focus is on what happened. But more frequently now, someone that Mike is interviewing will say something like, of course, you know, Claire was part of that gathering. And Mike will know exactly who Claire is. And I think some of you here, if you're thinking back kind of 30, 40 years in the diocese, will be able to guess who Claire is that they're referring to. And that's the type of story we have in today's gospel. Today's gospel is the sort of story that you can imagine Peter talking about and saying, and it was just as we were coming out of Jericho that we met Bartimaeus. And both Mark and Peter and the people that Mark is writing for will know exactly who Bartimaeus is. Why else name him? So most healings, it's the miracle itself that's remembered. But of course, if you're talking about something that's happened to a mutual acquaintance, you're going to say who that acquaintance is. Mark, you see, wasn't writing for us. He was writing for a particular part of the Christian community, his own church, essentially, his own diocese maybe. And the Christian community then was still quite small. So whenever you see a person's name in the story, you know it's put there because the author knew them, and so did the community that he's writing to. One of my favorite examples is when we read of Simon of Cyrene being asked to carry Jesus's cross. Now, when Mark tells that story, he adds in, you know, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who were clearly members of Mark's community. Now, Matthew and Luke tell the same story, but they don't mention Alexander and Rufus, presumably because no one knew them. They were part of a different community. Now, the reason I'm saying all this, the reason I'm telling you this, and the reason I love it, is because although, yes, our scriptures are holy and they're unlike any other book, They're also as earthy and grounded and real as Jesus was. These were real people, writing for a real group of people, about real people. Just as Mike is writing right now about real people in our diocese, for people within our diocese. It's quite possible that Bartimaeus actually read this story. It's even more likely that he was the one who told Mark the story. And you can imagine how Bartimaeus would have told it. You know, there was I sitting in the dirt with crowds of people milling around me, stepping on my robe, paying me as much attention as they paid the dust under their feet. And then suddenly I heard the rumor that Jesus was coming, and I couldn't help myself. I started shouting. You can imagine how he talked about this story. We must never forget that this was a real man, hurt, degraded, humiliated, ignored, who had the courage to call out to God, and God heard him. This was a real man who had been blind and had experienced all these degrading things, but who at the gentle touch of Jesus had color and light flood back into his life. And this was a man who, I would bet in his old age, was probably still excitedly telling the story to anyone who'd listen. His family were probably sick of it by now. But Mark recorded it because it was real. Now, I warned you that that first point was long. The next two are really quick. One is that Bartimaeus specifically remembers Jesus asking him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, it might have seemed obvious. He was blind, for heaven's sake. Clearly, he wanted Jesus to cure him. But Jesus clearly doesn't think that way. Jesus clearly doesn't presume that physical blindness is something that people have to be cured of. Sure, he did it when he was asked, but there's no sign that Jesus thought it was nearly as much of a problem as the stubborn ignorance and pride of his disciples, which really was something that Jesus had to keep working at. I'm grateful for that, because it reminds us that those who have what we call physical disabilities don't necessarily need healing. Talk to Mark in Queenstown. He doesn't feel he needs healing. He knows that he's completely whole as he is. It's their and our inner selves that need healing. And it's society's attitudes to people like that need healing. It was the attitude of Bartimaeus' society that forced him to be a beggar, not his blindness alone. So here's a question for us to ponder. Who do we disable simply through our attitudes towards them? And one final thing to take away, because I couldn't leave this. I love the phrase in this story where the crowd say to him, "Take heart, Jesus is calling you." Because just maybe we're the ones on the side of the road. Maybe we're the ones who feel dismissed and ignored. Maybe we're the ones that feel like the world is whirling past us and not taking any notice of everything it is that we are and that we have to offer. Or maybe if we think about it, there's someone we know like that and someone we know we treat that way. Well, we've got news for them and news for us. Take heart, because Jesus is calling you. And if we follow, maybe we'll be telling people about it as excitedly as Bartimaeus did for many years to come.